If you're driving along Route 52 in the Nevada desert and see a sign for the Ravenwood Motel, it's better to keep driving. Because something is terribly wrong here, and the last thing I want is for more people to die. The Ravenwood Motel is located on the forgotten Route 52, a worn-out stretch of asphalt that cuts through the Nevada desert. The road seems endless, surrounded only by dry vastness and distant mountains, whose silhouette is barely distinguishable on the horizon. There's not much around here except dust and silence, broken only by the sound of engines from the few travelers who dare to venture along this route. I arrived at the motel a week ago. I took the job as the night shift receptionist, thinking it would be a good way to make money without much effort. Few guests, simple work, plenty of time to read or even nap between customers. The ad online promised just that. A quiet routine, isolated from the world. Perfect, I thought. But from the first day, something deeply bothered me. Maybe it was the smell in the parking lot. A strong odor of rotting meat that never disappeared, no matter how much I tried to ignore it. Or maybe it was the guest rooms, all without windows, as if they were designed to isolate whoever was inside from the rest of the world. As I crossed the lobby for the first time, a shiver ran down my spine. Something here didn't feel right. I tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to being in an unfamiliar place, but it lingered. Every detail of the Ravenwood made me question whether taking this job was really a good idea. On the third night, I was alone in the lobby, trying to distract myself with an old book I had found on the small shelf behind the reception desk. The smell in the parking lot seemed to have intensified that night, and I could barely concentrate. That's when Grace appeared. She had worked at the Ravenwood for years, since she was a girl, according to rumors. Maybe that's why she seemed like part of the motel itself, as if both had been carved from the same strange and disturbing material. Grace was a woman of few words. She approached me without making a sound, which made me jump when I realized she was there. "Are you getting used to it?" she asked, her voice low and hoarse, as if worn by time and the desert. I just nodded, not wanting to seem more nervous than I already was. She watched me for a long moment, as if deciding whether or not to continue the conversation. Finally, she leaned a little closer, enough for me to smell the cigarette on her clothes. "Listen, kid," she said, with a seriousness that made every hair on my body stand on end. "Don't ask questions, ever. No matter what you see or hear here, keep your mouth shut." I frowned, confused. What did she mean by that? Before I could ask, she continued, "Avoid looking the guests in the eye. Believe me, it's for your own safety. And above all, don't get involved in their business. Here, what they do is none of our concern." Grace seemed more tense than ever. Her voice sounded like a mixture of warning and despair. It was clear that she spoke from experience, but still, my rational mind tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe they were just eccentric customers, people who preferred the extreme privacy that Ravenwood offered. But something in Grace's look, something in the way her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, said it wasn't just that. She was genuinely concerned for my safety. And as much as I wanted to understand what was going on, something inside me knew Grace was right. I shouldn't try to find out. She stared at me for a few more seconds, as if waiting to see if I would grasp the gravity of her words. Then, without another word, she returned to her duties, leaving me alone. Somehow, the air inside the Ravenwood seemed even heavier after that conversation. As the days passed, I began to notice how peculiar the guests at the Ravenwood Motel were. At first, I tried to ignore it, attributing their eccentricities to the fact that we were in an isolated area, where only the most unusual travelers ventured. But over time, the oddities began to pile up, making it impossible not to notice that there was something deeply wrong with these people. One night, around 2 in the morning, a man walked in through the front door. He was tall and thin, but what really caught my attention was that he wore sunglasses, even at that hour of the night. The glasses didn't fit right on his face. They seemed misaligned, as if his eyes weren't where they should be, forcing the lenses to sit awkwardly. He approached the counter, his movements slow and deliberate. A chill ran through me as he leaned in, the dark glasses reflecting the dim light of the reception. Instead of greeting me or asking about rooms, he spoke in a voice that seemed to come from a very distant place. "I need razor blades." That request, made in the dead of night, left me uneasy. I knew there were some razor blades in the small convenience store next to the reception, but I hesitated for a moment. Something about his tone didn't feel right, and my mind began to conjure up scenarios I preferred not to imagine. Why would someone desperately need razor blades at 2 in the morning? Even so, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease, I grabbed a blade and handed it to him. His hands were cold to the touch as he took it, and he said nothing more, just turned and walked out the door, disappearing into the dark hallway that led to the rooms. After he left, I realized I had been holding my breath. Grace always said not to ask questions, but my curiosity was tormenting me. There was something deeply wrong with that man, and the image of the misaligned glasses wouldn't leave my mind. That same week, a woman checked into the motel. She was covered in makeup, so much so that it looked almost like a grotesque mask. Her face was pale, but her lips were an intense, exaggerated red, and the contrast was disturbing. She wore a scarf that hid part of her face, but it was impossible not to notice the artificial shine on her skin. She barely spoke, just handed over her ID and accepted the room key. As she passed by me, I caught a strong scent of perfume, but there was something beneath that aroma, a metallic smell that made me swallow hard. These people didn't behave like the other guests I had served in previous jobs. Their movements, the way they looked at me or avoided looking, everything about them seemed out of place, as if they were trying to pass as human, but without complete success. Every night, my unease grew, and I began to wonder if I would ever truly understand what was happening at the Ravenwood Motel. It was my 6th night at the Ravenwood Motel, and the place seemed quieter than usual. I was in the lobby, reviewing the guest book to pass the time, when a sudden chill ran down my spine. I looked around, trying to identify the cause of that strange feeling, but there was nothing different, at least nothing I could see. The clock was nearing 3 in the morning when I decided to make my round through the hallways. It was something I didn't do often, preferring to stay in the safety of the lobby. But that night, something pushed me to walk through the motel. When I reached the end of the hallway, I noticed something unusual. The door to room 12 was ajar. I knew that room should be empty. No one had checked in for it in the past few days. My heart started to race, but I forced myself to continue. I pushed the door open cautiously, trying not to make a sound. The smell hit me first. It was worse than the odor in the parking lot, stronger and more concentrated. It was the smell of something rotten, something dead for too long. I felt my stomach churn, but I pressed on. The dim light from the hallway illuminated enough for me to see what was inside the room, and the sight made me freeze. There, in the center of the floor, something that looked like human skin was stretched out, as if it had been ripped from the body that wore it and left behind, discarded. The skin was stretched in a bizarre manner, with no sign of bones or muscles, just the thin, pale surface, like a macabre cocoon. The face, if it could be called that, was empty, the eye sockets hollow, and the mouth open in a silent scream. The skin looked so real, so human, that my brain took a moment to process what I was seeing. I involuntarily stepped back, stumbling and almost falling as my eyes couldn't tear themselves away from that hellish sight. The stench of decay intensified with every second I spent there. My lungs burned as I inhaled that fetid air, and I finally managed to gather the strength to run out of the room. I slammed the door shut, as if that could contain the horror of what I had seen. Back in the lobby, my hands were trembling so much that I could barely hold the room key. Panic began to take hold, my mind spinning around the idea that what I had seen wasn't possible, couldn't be real. But the image of that skin, that thing, was burned into my mind. Every detail, every inch of that nightmare stretched on the floor. I remembered Grace's words, "Don't ask questions." But how could I ignore what I had just seen? Something terrible was happening at the Ravenwood Motel, something that went beyond the bizarre, the unusual. It was something monstrous, and I didn't know if I was ready to find out what else was lurking behind the doors of this cursed place. I barely managed to sleep after what I saw in room 12. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of that stretched skin came back to my mind, more vivid and disturbing. The clock barely struck 4 in the morning when I forced myself to get back to work. The lobby was empty and silent, except for the constant buzzing of the fluorescent lights. I tried to convince myself that it was all some kind of nightmare, that my exhaustion was playing tricks on me. But the reality was much worse. Still shaken, I went to get a bottle of water from the small store next to the reception. The hallway was partially dark, the lights flickering in an irritating rhythm. When I turned to return to the lobby, I saw a figure standing at the entrance of the motel. It was a woman, one of the many strange guests I had seen in recent days, but something about her was even more disturbing. She stood motionless, almost blending into the darkness. But as she approached, the details of her face began to reveal themselves. It was her eyes that scared me first. They were slightly misplaced, a bit out of where they should be, as if they had been repositioned incorrectly. The shine in her eyes was cold, lifeless, and the more I looked, the more my discomfort turned into pure terror. Her lips were thin, but asymmetrical, twisted at a strange angle, as if they had been stitched back onto her face after something terrible had happened. She didn't seem natural, and with each step she took towards me, the distortion of her features seemed to increase. I felt my feet freeze on the floor, unable to move. She made no sound, just that fixed stare that seemed to pierce through me. It was as if her presence sucked all the air out of the hallway, making each breath difficult. The woman kept advancing, and something about her movements was profoundly wrong, almost mechanical, but clumsy, like a puppet controlled by a clumsy ventriloquist. When she was just a few meters from me, a survival instinct finally snapped me out of my stupor. I turned and ran back to the lobby, feeling her presence right behind me, almost breathing down my neck. The sound of her footsteps was irregular, but relentless, as if she was moving at a frequency that didn't belong to this world. I threw myself into the lobby and locked the door behind me, my fingers trembling so much that I almost dropped the key. For a moment, everything was silent, and I began to think I had escaped. But then, I heard a soft, disturbing sound that froze my blood. A whistle. It was low, but clear, as if someone was right outside. The sound echoed, filling the empty lobby. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that I was imagining things, but the whistle continued, incessant, and there was something deeply wrong with it. It wasn't a normal whistle. There was something torturous about it, as if each note was out of tune, scratching at my sanity. I backed away from the door slowly, trying not to make any noise, but the whistle continued, moving from one window to another, as if she was circling the building, looking for a way in. I tried to convince myself that it couldn't be real, that it was all in my head, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, wouldn't leave me. Finally, the whistle stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse, because it left room for my imagination to run wild. I knew that if I looked out the window, I would see her out there, waiting. I never found out what that woman really was, or what she wanted from me. All I know is that that night, I was certain that the Ravenwood Motel was not a place for humans, and that maybe I had already been there for too long. A storm began suddenly, something unusual in the Nevada desert. The heavy raindrops pounded furiously against the windows, and the wind howled like a hungry predator. The motel was shrouded in an even denser darkness than usual, as if the storm brought with it a threat greater than nature itself. I tried to focus on anything other than the events of the previous nights, when the front door burst open with a bang, bringing in a gust of wind and rain. A man entered, drenched, but seemingly indifferent to the storm raging outside. He appeared to be in his 50s, with a scarred face and eyes that seemed to hide centuries of secrets. "You need to help me," he said, his voice firm but laden with a dark urgency. I hesitated. The rule was clear: avoid getting involved in the guest's business. But something in that man's look made me realize that ignoring him could be even worse. Before I could respond, he approached the counter, his clothes dripping a puddle on the floor. "There's no time to explain. You need to come with me now." My mind struggled between reason and the instinct to survive. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to refuse, not to leave that safe lobby. But the man gave me a look that seemed to pierce my soul, and suddenly, the warmth of the lobby seemed to disappear, leaving only a cold that chilled me to the bone. He didn't wait for my answer. He grabbed my arm with surprising strength and pulled me out into the storm. Outside, the world was a chaos of water and wind, and the motel seemed like a ship adrift on the ocean. I couldn't see far ahead, only the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the man's silhouette in front of me. We walked quickly to the block of rooms. He dragged me to one of them, room 16, without ever letting go of my arm. When we arrived, he stopped at the door, finally releasing me. "Now listen carefully," he said, his voice low but laden with a gravity that made me tremble. "You're the bait." "What?" My heart raced at those words. Before I could question him, he pushed me into the room, his eyes locked on mine. "She's after you. From the beginning, you were chosen. I'm here to end this, but she knows that. She'll use every trick to get you. No matter what happens, you can't let her touch you." Before I could understand what he was saying, I heard a sound behind me, a soft but unmistakable noise. The whistle, the same torturous, off-key whistle that had haunted me the night before. I turned slowly, and there, in the open doorway of the room, was the woman. But she was no longer just a woman. Her eyes, already misplaced, now seemed to glow with a light of their own, and her skin began to stretch, as if something was pushing from the inside out. Her lips opened in a grotesque smile, revealing rows of irregular, sharp teeth. With a quick movement, she lunged at us, and the man shouted something I couldn't understand. He rushed forward, trying to intercept her, but before he could reach her, the woman twisted in an impossible way, her limbs stretching and breaking until what stood before me was no longer human. The creature that emerged was a vision straight out of the worst nightmares. The skin hung in strips, revealing twisted, pulsating flesh underneath. Her limbs, now long and disproportionate, stretched at bizarre angles, like a puppet with broken bones. The eyes, those misplaced eyes, now fixed on me with a hunger that was not of this world. The man threw himself at the creature, trying to hold her back, but she was quick and fierce. He shouted for me to run, but I was paralyzed, the terror rooting me to the spot. I watched as the creature bit into the man's arm with brutal force, the sound of bones breaking echoing in the room. Finally, survival instinct took over, and I turned and ran out of the room, the storm roaring around me. The sound of the struggle between the man and the creature was lost in the wind, and the hellish whistle continued, pursuing me as I fled towards the lobby. I didn't know what that man had planned, nor what I had just witnessed, but one thing was certain. I was no longer safe anywhere. The storm was still raging when I finally managed to lock myself in the motel lobby. The sound of the door slamming echoed in the empty space, but it wasn't enough to drown out the noise of the intense rain outside. My heart was still racing, and the fear I felt almost prevented me from thinking clearly. With every flash of lightning that lit up the lobby, I cringed, expecting to see that monstrous creature emerging from the shadows. But instead, I heard the distant sound of sirens, growing louder until the red and blue lights flashed outside. It was the police. Deep down, a part of me was relieved, clinging to the idea that finally someone could help me, protect me. However, at the same time, something told me that this story wouldn't end simply. 2 officers hurried into the lobby, both looking more irritated than concerned. One of them, a burly man with a serious expression and tired eyes, approached me while the other inspected the area. They seemed to know the Ravenwood well, which made me even more uncomfortable. "Are you all right?" the officer asked, but his voice was strangely devoid of empathy. It was an automatic question without real interest in the answer. Before I could respond, he continued, "What happened here?" I was about to tell them everything. The strange man, the monstrous woman, the hellish whistle. But when I began to speak, the officer raised a hand, silencing me. "Listen, son," he said, his eyes fixed on mine. "You need to forget what you saw here. No matter what happened, it's none of your business." "What do you mean, forget?" I protested, feeling anger and fear mixing in my voice. "I saw that thing. She wasn't human." The 2 officers exchanged glances, a silent exchange of information that I couldn't understand. The second officer, a thinner man with a scar on his cheek, approached and put a hand on my shoulder, an attempt to calm me that only made me more nervous. "Look, kid," he began, in a tone meant to be reassuring but failed miserably. "Sometimes things happen in places like this, things that are better left untried to understand. We call it an infestation." Infestation? The word seemed out of place, inadequate to describe the horror I had witnessed. "No matter what you saw nothing," insisted the first officer, the threatening tone now more evident. "That's how it works. You're going to leave here, forget this night, and continue with your life. It's for your own good." I was perplexed. How did they expect me to just forget? My mind was swirling with questions, but the look on the officers' faces made me realize I wouldn't get any answers. They knew something terrible, but they weren't willing to share, and they definitely didn't want me to pursue it. "And the man who was with me?" I asked, my voice trembling. He tried to help me. He's out there, in the room." "There was no man," the second officer interrupted, his voice dry. "There was no one but you." "Got it." I wanted to protest, wanted to demand they do something, but the truth is, the fear that they were right choked me. If they were willing to cover up something so horrible, then what else could be happening at that motel? The officers backed away, indicating that the conversation was over. Before leaving, the first officer turned and gave me one last look. "Go home, kid. And remember, you didn't see anything." They left as quickly as they arrived, leaving me alone again in the silent lobby. Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, but inside me, the chaos continued. I knew what I had seen was real, and I knew that, somehow, I was involved in something much bigger and more terrifying than I could imagine. But deep down, I also knew that following their advice was the only chance I had to survive. Doubt consumed me. Forget or discover the truth. The Ravenwood Motel wasn't just a resting place on Route 52. It was a place where the impossible became reality, and where anyone who ventured to look beyond the surface risked being swallowed by the darkness. After the officers left, the lobby of the Ravenwood Motel plunged into an almost sepulchral silence. I stood there, trying to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. My heart was still racing, and the echo of their words, "You didn't see anything," kept reverberating in my mind. It was advice that made perfect sense on the surface, but at the same time, it was impossible to follow. How could I forget what I had seen? How could I erase from my memory the distorted face of that woman and the grotesque transformation I had witnessed? I wanted to leave. Everything inside me screamed to grab my things, walk out the door, and never look back. But while my body trembled with fear, my mind wrestled with another concern, one that was almost as strong as the terror I felt. Money. I needed this job. Without it, I knew life would be hard, maybe impossible. The bills were already piling up, and the little savings I had barely covered a week's expenses. At first, the job at Ravenwood seemed like the perfect solution. Easy money in a remote place where no one would bother me. Now, it had become a prison where every shift was a game of Russian roulette. I sat in the chair behind the counter, holding my head in my hands. I didn't want to go back to that motel, didn't want to spend another night in that cursed place. But what would happen if I quit? The reality out there wasn't any easier. No job, no money, what awaited me was misery. Unpaid bills, the constant pressure, the shame of failing once again. But the alternative was the unknown, something much more dangerous than poverty. I knew that every night at Ravenwood, I risked my life, maybe even my sanity. The monstrous woman, the skin in room 12, the bizarre guests, all pointed to forces there that I couldn't comprehend, much less control. I stood up and began to pace the lobby, the storm outside now a mere memory. What was more important, keeping safe and abandoning the job, or risking everything for a little money? What was worth more, my life or the possibility of losing everything and ending up on the street? Anger and fear consumed me. Anger at myself for taking the job. Anger at the world for putting me in such an impossible position. And fear of going back to that dark hallway. Fear of seeing something worse than I had already seen. Fear that maybe, deep down, there was no escape no matter what I decided. I thought of Grace and her warnings. She was trapped there too, working for years. Maybe she had faced the same dilemma as I. Maybe she had decided that the risk was better than the certainty of poverty. And now she lived in that hell night after night. I could end up like her, or worse, I could end up like that man who tried to help me, or like the creature he fought. But what if I could hold out a little longer? Maybe with time I'd get used to it just like Grace. Maybe I could save enough to get out of there, never having to worry about money again. Or maybe, and this was the most terrifying possibility of all, I'd never leave. Maybe, once trapped in Ravenwood, there was no way out. I knew that, in the end, I would have to make a decision. And no matter how much I pondered, the fear of poverty and the terror of the unknown would continue to clash, tearing my sanity apart one piece at a time. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I sat down again, staring at the clock on the wall. I had one more hour before my shift ended, and I knew that when it was time to return, I would have to decide. Continue at Ravenwood, facing horrors I could barely imagine, or leave and face a reality that, in some way, was equally terrifying. Only time would tell what the price would be for either choice. The following days were torture for my mind. Every time I entered the Ravenwood Motel, I felt like the building itself was conspiring against me, swallowing me into an abyss of madness and horror. I tried to push the fear away, focusing on the routine, but normality seemed like an impossible concept in that place. The nights were long, and the guests, well, they started to seem even stranger, if that was possible. Now, It was as if each one who passed through the lobby was trying to disguise themselves, masking their true intentions and forms. But the more disguised they tried to appear, the more obvious it became that something was deeply wrong with them. One of the first things I noticed was the increasing number of guests wearing unusual clothing, almost as if they were trying to hide their bodies. They came wrapped in wide coats, hats that covered their faces, and sunglasses that, once again, were worn misaligned, as if the eyes behind them weren't in the right place. One night, a woman entered the lobby, wearing a long dress and a veil that almost completely covered her face. She moved stiffly, as if her joints were frozen, or perhaps dislocated. When she handed me her ID for check-in, I couldn't help but notice her hands. The fingers were too long, thin, and had extra joints that shouldn't be there. I tried to avoid eye contact, as Grace had advised, but it was impossible not to feel the chill those hands caused. Another guest who particularly unsettled me was a man who seemed to be wearing several layers of clothing, despite the scorching heat of the desert. His face was almost completely hidden by a fake beard, which hung awkwardly. When he smiled at me, I noticed that the teeth were irregular, as if they had been sharpened intentionally. The mouth seemed like a dark hole, much larger than it should be, and the sound of his voice was low and guttural, as if the words were being forced out. Still, the most disturbing behavior came from a group of 3 people who checked in together. They arrived late at night, each wearing theatrical masks, the kind that cover half the face. Their clothes were old-fashioned, as if they had stepped out of another era, and their movements were completely synchronized, as if they were somehow invisibly linked. When one of them spoke, the other 2 remained completely still, not even blinking like statues. Their eyes behind the masks were black and empty, and when a flash of lightning briefly illuminated the lobby, I saw that their skin, where it wasn't covered, had a pale, almost gray tone, with dark veins pulsing just beneath the surface. They didn't linger in the lobby, going straight to their room, but the absolute silence they left behind was suffocating. These guests never talked to each other, nor with other guests. They seemed to live in their own world, oblivious to normal human interaction. And that made me even more nervous. It was as if they were all there for a specific reason, a sinister goal that I couldn't comprehend. Grace noticed my unease, but did nothing to ease my discomfort. She just looked at me with that grave expression, as if she knew what was coming, but was powerless to stop it. Each night, the atmosphere of terror intensified. The feeling that something was about to happen hung in the air, heavy as lead. I started avoiding the dark, empty hallways, staying as much as possible in the lit lobby, even though the cold light of the fluorescent lamps was little comfort. The behavior of these guests was becoming increasingly intrusive, as if their masks and disguises were less to hide themselves, and more to protect whatever was behind them. And the scariest thing was that, over time, I began to feel that it wasn't just them watching me. The motel itself seemed to be alive, breathing, waiting, as if it was eager to reveal its darkest secret. I knew I needed to leave, but each day, each shift, I felt more trapped, more entangled in the web of horrors that was the Ravenwood Motel. And even knowing the dangers, I kept coming back because the alternative, the world outside and the debts waiting for me, seemed somehow equally terrifying. The decision to leave the Ravenwood Motel finally solidified on a night I will never forget. The motel was immersed in an oppressive silence, the only company being the constant buzz of the fluorescent lights and the wind outside, which made the old walls creak as if they were writhing in pain. It was past midnight, and I was almost convinced that this would be a relatively quiet night, at least as quiet as it could be in a place like Ravenwood. I was behind the counter, reading a book to try to ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That's when I heard a strange noise coming from one of the hallways. A low, wet noise, like something being torn. a sound that immediately sent a chill down my spine. Hesitant, I got up and walked towards the sound, each step heavy and reluctant. I knew I shouldn't investigate, that I should just let it go. But some greater force, perhaps the need to understand the horror surrounding me, pushed me forward. The sound came from one of the rooms that, as far as I knew, should be empty that night. The door was ajar, and the light inside was dim, almost non-existent. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open carefully. What I saw inside was the breaking point for my sanity. In the center of the room, lit by a single weak lamp, was a group of 3 guests. They were kneeling around something that, at first, I couldn't discern. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized they were feeding. Not on food, but on a human body. The corpse was sprawled on the floor, its glazed eyes fixed on the ceiling, the expression frozen in horror on its face. The clothes were torn, and the flesh of the body, which no longer looked entirely human, was exposed, being devoured with animalistic fervor. The creatures that I once believed were humans now revealed their true nature. Their faces twisted, mouths opening at impossible angles, sharp teeth tearing chunks of flesh like hungry predators. The horror of the scene was more than I could bear. I involuntarily stepped back, stumbling into the hallway wall. The noise caught the attention of one of the creatures, who raised its head and looked me directly in the eyes. What was once a guest was now an aberration with black, empty eyes, like a bottomless pit that seemed to suck all the light around it. Adrenaline took over, and without thinking twice, I turned and ran. I ran as if my life depended on it, and maybe it did. Each step echoed in the empty hallways, but I didn't care about the noise. Desperation guided me. I didn't look back, didn't want to see if they were following me. All I knew was that I had to get out of there. When I finally reached the reception, I grabbed my things with trembling hands and ran out the front door, not even bothering to lock it. Outside, the night was calm, but the terror I felt inside was greater than any storm. I got into my car, my hands still shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared, and I sped out of that cursed parking lot as fast as I could. In the rearview mirror, I saw the motel fading into the distance, a lonely, deformed structure in the middle of the desert, like a tumor on the earth. The lights of the Ravenwood quickly disappeared into the darkness, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I drove along Route 52 until the sky began to lighten, the sun rising on the horizon as a sign that I had escaped, at least for now. Now all I can do is warn others. There's no way to live normally after an experience like that, no way to forget. That's why I'm writing this, a warning to everyone who might hear me. If you're driving along Route 52 in Nevada and spot the Ravenwood Motel, don't stop. Keep going, don't look back, and keep driving until you're far, far away from that place. The Ravenwood Motel isn't just an ordinary motel. It's a trap, a tear in reality where the most horrible things exist. If you stop there, you might never leave. And if you do, you'll never be the same. Please don't ask questions. Don't try to find out more. And above all, don't go near it. Because if you do, maybe the next thing to disappear into the vastness of the desert will be you. And if you like this story, subscribe to the channel and take the opportunity to watch the next story that's playing on the screen.